Hello there. Hello there, everybody. This is Glenn Loury, Brown University, host of The Glenn Show at Substack and also at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/C/Glenn Loury Show. I'm with Daniel Bessner. He is assistant professor.
Associate. I am tenured.
Oh, he is. I beg your pardon. Daniel is associate professor. Congratulations, Daniel.
Thank you.
At the Henry Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, and has been a frequent guest in the past on The Glenn Show, although I think it's been about a year or so since Daniel last appeared. Daniel heroically volunteered to interview me in a series of posts, which you guys can still find. I think there are 4 of them from 10, 12 months ago, to help me get my still in progress memoir in hand, although my interviews with Daniel were very helpful. So he's back. Daniel writes for The Nation and other places. Where else do you write for, Daniel?
I write for The Nation. I've written for The Times, Washington Post, Guardian. I'm a contributing editor at socialist magazine Jacobin. And most important for podcast listeners, I'm a co-host of a podcast called American Prestige Foreign Affairs Podcast, heterodox analysis to say the least.
I think it's fair to say that Daniel is coming from the left of the center aisle in American politics as he takes his approach to some of these critical issues, and he and I have gone back and forth in that spirit in the past. I'd be very curious to know what you're thinking about foreign affairs going on just now, but I have first to tell you, Daniel, that my wife caught you as a guest on Chapo Trap House.
Oh, your wife's a Chapo listener.
What you had to say.
That's great. Your wife's a Chapo listener. That's great.
My wife is a Chapo listener amongst, I don't know, maybe a dozen other periodical podcast stuff that goes on. And she's a Bernie Sanders Democrat. And, actually, I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders progressive. She'd be furious if she heard me call her a Democrat.
I'm with your wife. I'm with your wife. That's so funny that she listens to Chapo, and I'm glad she liked the appearance. It's I always like going on them. It's a fun show.
You are in foreign affairs there, foreign studies, international studies at the University of Washington, and I want to know what's up with the hysteria. Is it about what's going on?
I think that's a fair word. What I want to do is actually take a step back, because I think that oftentimes in this country there is an impulse to do what I call play risk, right? Since 1945, when the United States said we're going to be the superpower, and especially since 1989, when that became a feasible position with the end of the Cold War, and then in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Americans, and I include myself among this population, basically look at the world and feel that they have the right and ability and duty even to make decisions, right, about what goes on in Ukraine. And I think this is important because I think this reflects an assumption of American military and economic primacy, the idea that the United States should have this sort of global power and should decide, for example, what happens in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. But I think what we're seeing here, and I think what Putin's action shows, is that there's a relative decline in American power worldwide. I don't think Russia would have attempted this in 1995, even in 2002, 2003, maybe even later, because Ukraine is so far west when you're looking at Russia as compared to Georgia. But what this shows is that there are now going to be challenges. Now there are going to be regional powers who are going to be challenging American global hegemony, because clearly this is not in what the United States policy elite wants. So I think this is an important time to basically question the very assumption of primacy that pretty much everyone listening today grew up with and was born into. Everyone born after 1945, or really after 1940. When this decision was made. I think that the decision was made actually in the summer of 1940 after the fall of France. This is the work of Stephen Wertheim in his book Tomorrow the World, and Americans are like, whoa, there could be another power.
The decision was made to arrogate to ourselves a role of primacy and the management of global affairs.
Right.
Is
Right.
that what you refer to when you
Right.
say
Because
the decision?
exactly. The decision, I would call it for primacy, right? The United States has always been an expansionist power. You start with the colonies, you head west, you have indigenous genocide, you have occupation, settler colonialism, blah, blah, blah. Not blah, 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 but like just there's a lot there. I'm just going to go over the story quickly. Then you have in 1823, the Declaration of the Monroe Doctrine, which is we're going to control the Western Hemisphere. You have in 1898, the seizure of colonies in the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Today, of course, the U.S. has 5 colonies. And then in 1945, you have basically the U.S. saying the globe is our area. Doesn't really become a reality, I don't think, until after the end of the Cold War, but the decision for primacy is made. But what we're seeing now with the so-called rise of China and, Russian revanchism, whatever you want to call it, is that
So-called rise of China.
yeah. Well, I just don't think China has global ambitions like the United States does. I think like the truly global ambition is kind of an American pathology. I don't think even if let's say China was in the US position in 1945, it doesn't seem to me like they necessarily would have built, the 750 overseas military bases, et cetera, et cetera. I think they want regional hegemony. I don't think they want genuinely global hegemony like the United States has. So that's what I mean by so-called rise. Of course, China has risen, it's developed, particularly in its region, et cetera. But I don't think it has truly global ambitions. I think what Americans do is they actually impute our global ambitions onto other powers. And we could get into why I think that, but I think the United States, partially due to its universalist Protestant heritage, has like a particular global vision of its power and sort of bringing the city on a hill to the rest of the world that other nation states don't quite have, at least in my opinion.
When you refer to the United States, who are you talking about? Is it a cultural? Is it a political? Is it the way that college students are educated to think about their country? Is it a set of interests like military-industrial complex or whatever? Is it ideological? I mean, what are you talking about when you say the U.S. has these? And by the way, these things are presumed to be bad by your tone of voice. Is it clear that having the ambition to influence developments around the world on behalf of a set of ideas or ideals is necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I'll actually take the last question first, and then I'll go back. I mean, for this, like I just point to the history. The United States has acted brutally across the world, and that my philosophical position is as a humanist. I'm not a nationalist, even though I understand that the nation state is an important container. I think every human life is equal, and that every human life should be taken, seriously, is philosophically equal. And oftentimes when the United States tries to intervene abroad, it has disastrous consequences. And so look at the historian Paul Chamberlain, his book, I think it's called Rethinking the Cold War's Killing Fields, Rethinking the Long Peace. And he shows that the Cold War, which I think ultimately was mostly, not totally, but mostly an American-driven project. I think that the Soviet Union didn't really want to fight a Cold War. It was not nearly as powerful as the United States. It was not nearly as developed. It was not nearly as rich and couldn't quite afford to fight the Cold War. And I think it was fighting the Cold War actually led to its internal collapse. It didn't really want to fight it. But I think that the Cold War, he shows had between 20 and 25 million deaths. The political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke, in her book Covert Regime Change, showed that the United States tried to covertly overthrow regimes 66 times. It succeeded 25 times, but even when it didn't succeed, it engendered authoritarian outcomes, around the world. We could do the doxology at this point: Iran, Guatemala, Chile, Indonesia, the Congo, Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think if you look at the history, it's not a project that has done particular good for the world. Then, if you wanted to get meta,
pardon my naivete, were the influence of the Soviet Union to have prevailed in these various places, their people would be better off, you claim?
I don't think that was a possibility. I don't think the Soviet Union was rich enough or had designs like that in the same way. The United States was uniquely powerful after World War II. It had the capacity to do these things. So the Soviet Union did intervene. I'm not like saying they didn't by any stretch of the imagination. But from this perspective in 2022, we could just see the United States was way more powerful than the Soviet Union and had way more capacity to shape world affairs, in my opinion. And also, I think,
I'm confused now. If the U.S. had employed that power advantage on behalf of its global agenda, I'm taking it that you think that's not a good thing. Uh, I'm trying to get you to um, come to grips with the fact that there were ideas behind these different powers that seem to have had different consequences for the prosperity and the security and the liberty of the people in the places that uh, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union were coming into conflict. I mean, forgive me again for my naivete. It's just hard for me to imagine that the Soviet Union prevailing or its allies and clients that would have fostered economic development to a greater extent, or it would have led to a greater degree of human freedom than is currently being enjoyed by people in these places where the U.S. has had influence.
I guess it depends now. I'm doing a sort of a edited volume on Cold War liberalism. Depends what you mean by freedom. Free, negative liberty, positive liberty. If the choice is between having freedom of speech or, freedom from homelessness, what would someone take? I mean, these are different definitions, right? So it's in wherever, how you come down on that question ultimately comes down to your ideological predilections. Do you think positive liberty is more important? Do you think negative liberty is more important? Do you think development is innately good? The planet might have something to say about that, And so I think these are difficult questions, and how we interpret them will change as we see what happens. If we reach whatever wet bulb 5 degrees or whatever it's called, then we'll say, maybe U.S. consumptive patterns weren't the best thing for humanity as a whole. So I think these things are ever changing. So that's where I would answer that, but I would also just say, I don't think the Soviet Union had the capacity to be what the United States was. I just don't think it had the power and the ability to do that. It wasn't as developed, it was a peasant society that very, very, very rapidly industrialized with enormous human consequences, very negative human consequences. Whereas the United States in 1945 controlled 50% of world manufacturing. They're not comparable. Even though the Soviet Union had lots of people, particularly when you're stationed, when you're thinking about Europe, I think Eisenhower was right. I think nuclear weapons mitigated a lot of that advantage. So I think the U.S. was in a unique position after World War II to be a truly global power in a way that the Soviet Union wasn't. And whether that was good or bad for people, I think it depends on where you're ideologically standing. Essentially,
and the nuclear standoff, the Cuban Missile Crisis, mutual assured destruction.
That was bad.
Was that a figment of my imagination as well? Growing up as a boy in the post-World War II era, where there was a lot of concern about the threat posed by a nuclear.
No, absolutely not. That was absolutely not a figment of your imagination. But then they share equal responsibility there. I mean, that's the U.S. and Soviet Union. You could imagine a world, maybe, I'm specifically writing about the year 1946, and there are genuine, attempts to have international control of atomic weaponry. There was a famous book called One World or None, where the head of the Air Force General Hap Arnold has an essay where he's like, we need to control, everyone needs to control these things, but that ended pretty quickly. No, I mean, I assign equal responsibility for that. Absolutely. I do think that the Cold War could have ended earlier if not for the United States. So I guess ultimately then I assign the United States more responsibility. But yeah, no, the Soviet Union was a nuclear power and it absolutely sought nuclear weapons and it absolutely, might have used them in certain circumstances. I don't deny that at all.
Now, what about the Western Europeans, our NATO allies who were concerned about the quote unquote threat posed by the Soviet Union? Was that a figment of their imaginations as well?
I don't think the Soviet Union was ever going to invade Western Europe. I mean, I don't think they could have known that in 1945. So, or when NATO was founded, I believe in 49. So, I mean, I don't begrudge them that. That was a really freaky 30 years with World War I, then followed by World War II. Massive human destruction, massive population movements. But I think it's fair to say now we have a pretty good sense that was never really in the cards for the Soviet Union to invade France or to invade Britain, particularly the fact that the U.S. had a nuclear monopoly for 4 years and was able to essentially stabilize those regimes through Marshall Plan aid and things like that. When I'm looking at the time, you couldn't have known that necessarily, but I think it's absurd that NATO continues to exist today Why was NATO founded? To keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. None of those things really hold any longer. Europe is very, very rich, and why is the U.S. footing any of their defense bill? To me, it's wild. To me, that should be like a cross-ideological position. Why the hell is the U.S. paying for so much of European defense?
Donald Trump on behalf of your position.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hear it more and more across the political spectrum, that Europe is very rich, and I would say, like, as an ontological position, the people in a region are more able to decide what's good for their region than an exogenous power sort of coming in and calling the shots to a significant degree. But for the American taxpayer, why is the American taxpayer footing any of NATO's bills? Does France really need that? Does Britain really need that? Does Germany really need that? These are powerful, rich countries. Why are we paying for their defense? Why do we even have a say over their defense? But you'll notice Trump might have said that, but he didn't do a damn thing about NATO. So, whatever what he might have said, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, but we were talking about Ukraine, and I threw you off track.
Okay.
You were making the point that the U.S. has an expansionist vision about its role in the world, a global, taking care of it. Everything is in our backyard. We really care about the status of Taiwan.
Right. Precisely.
And that's another example.
Well,
but
this is what I would say. I don't think we really do care. So this is, I think, the problem, right? I think there's like this inertial position. I don't think if the PRC there are going to be experts who say, well, they can't do this. The weapons. I'm just saying philosophically, if the PRC invaded Taiwan, I do not think the United States would fight World War III over it. I do not think that is what will happen. Just like I don't think the United States would fight a World War III over Ukraine, as we're seeing right now. So what I actually fear, well, not really fear, that might not be the right word, but I think that in the next 15, 20 years, we're not going to do things like re-examine the assumption of primacy. China might do something dramatic with Taiwan. The United States will then just retreat and actually leave our allies unprepared to deal with what's actually happening in that region, which is the rise of Chinese regional hegemony. I don't think that's necessarily, without value judgments, whether that's good or whether that's bad, that seems to be a reality that is going to happen in the next 15, 20, 25, 30 years, whenever. So the United States...
You dropped the so-called modifier there.
Well, when we're talking about regional, yeah. Regional, okay. It's factual. When we're talking about global, it's not.
Got it.
And I think it's framed globally in the media and places like China's going to get into Latin America. They've made some moves, but China's not going to expand to the Western Hemisphere. That's not a goal of the People's Republic of China or the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's absurd to say that. But in the region, they want regional hegemony, which they had for, a long time. So I think that what U.S. policy elites need to do is need to be examining this new reality and actually preparing for it and preparing South Korea, Japan, other regional allies for what is going to be a changing regional geostrategic structure. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there'll be some dramatic event and the U.S. will just not totally cut and run, but will do what's in its interest, which is not to fight World War III with a Chinese regional hegemon. And so I just think our foreign policy discourse is very, whatever the opposite of elevated is.
So we're bluffing.
Yeah. And that's what Putin's basically doing. I think what Putin's showing the world is that U.S. relative power is declining. That the United States is not going to, go to war over Ukraine or go to war over another power, redrawing international boundaries. And of course, the ironic thing is Putin loves referring to Kosovo and how the United States essentially did that with regards to Serbia in the 1990s. He's like, see, I'm showing I could also redraw the international boundaries. You thought it was only you, but Russia's a great power. We're not just a middle power. We're a great power. And I think that's what Putin's really trying to do here.
So am I wrong to be terrified?
Yes.
At the prospect that somebody, I don't think Joseph Biden is necessarily that somebody, but what do I know? And, when they call your bluff and you turn the table over.
Like Biden will do something dramatic.
Yeah. And as a way of, I'm tough. I'm not going to be pushed around. We're the United fucking States of America. And we stand for the security, recognition of sovereign borders, democracy, et cetera, and get us into a conflict that we'll regret down the road.
I don't see that happening. Of course, it's always a possibility. Biden could theoretically do something like that, especially because Congress doesn't have to declare war anymore, even though the Constitution says that. But I find it hard to see right now because there's so little U.S. interest in what's happening there. There's no real U.S. interests there. It could happen. This is the problem with events like this. It's not impossible,
Okay.
but I don't think that's likely.
So rather than a vain, flailing conflict, you see a loss of credibility and the subsequent unraveling of trust in our commitments by allies.
Not necessarily, because I think I bet most world leaders know like who the U.S.'s like major allies really are and who they aren't. World leaders aren't foolish for the most part. The U.S. might do something with regards Western Europe, with Israel, Saudi Arabia right now, but it's not like it's going to fight in Eastern Europe. So I don't think there's a real loss in U.S. credibility. The loss in credibility is just the last 20 years of American history with Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, et cetera, et cetera. What is dangerous to me about Ukraine is that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And I think this 30 years ago, and I think this suggests to international powers, like, never, ever give up your nuclear weapons, particularly after Gaddafi. Gaddafi also gave up his nuclear program.
Gaddafi,
yeah, and look what happened to him. So I think if we're talking macro, that is the most problematic thing. This suggests that proliferation is a good, is what you should do as a state. Like, if you don't have nuclear weapons, then you don't have a deterrent. So that to me is the most frightening thing about this particular event when we're talking globally, but I don't think there's going to be American troops sent to Ukraine. There's not. Categorically, there will not be American, boots on the ground. They might send weapons. They might send quote unquote advisors, which I guess are boots on the ground, but I don't think we'll see something like Iraq there.
All right, now I'm trying to think. I think of Matt Taibbi, a journalist who writes in the spirit that you are giving voice to. About the Ukraine crisis, but the mainstream media not so much.
Yeah, because they have the assumption of primacy. I mean, like, the average writer at the New York Times thinks it's God's given right to the United States to govern the entire world now and forever. They don't even know. It's like the water they swim in. It's the air they breathe. They don't even know that's what they think, but that's what they think, and that's, I think, extraordinarily problematic. And it wasn't always the case. If you went to the 30s, the Times does not believe that. It's a post-World War II thing, and it's a post-Cold War thing, especially. The end of history moment, the unilateral moment. We're still living in that ideologically, even if the power realities on the ground suggest otherwise.
All right, primer on Ukraine. From Daniel Bessner. I apologize to the hawks out there in the audience who want me to wave the flag here. I'm not in a position to do so because I don't have a knowledge base sufficient, and I'm frankly intrigued by Daniel's outlook and think it needs to be taken seriously. What else we want to talk about, Daniel? You mentioned Whoopi Goldberg to change the subject.
An equally important event in world history.
What do you make of the controversy? You're Jewish, as I understand. I don't know if that
what gives it away.
The way in which you affects the way in which you read the Whoopi Goldberg phenomenon. But what do you make of it?
Well, to me, it was so interesting that people got so upset about it because it seemed to me very obvious what was happening. She was basically using the American liberal paradigm of what race is, which is based essentially on phenotype, and applying it to a context where that didn't it wasn't accurate. I think it was as simple as that. And I think it was absurd that people got so upset about it. And what was so frustrating is that I don't know if you saw her going on Colbert, but it was interesting. She didn't.
I did not.
So basically, she's like, okay, I just won't talk about it anymore. That was her conclusion. She's like, she didn't apologize, and I don't think that she needed to apologize. I think a public apology is not really an apology. That's not how apologies function. What are you apologizing to the public? Like, what the hell are you talking
It's
about?
a
It's not an apology.
performance.
Yeah, it's a performance. It's a political communication in some sense.
Yeah.
But it was such an easy thing to see through, and it just showed how like degraded our political discourse has become. Because that's actually an interesting thing. Race doesn't function in every society at all historical moments in the same way, right? That is provided a learning opportunity for what you talk about. In 1941, Germany, or really Poland, to be a Jew was not to be white in the sense that you meant it. Also, one could say that's true of the United States. In 1935, being a Jew you weren't quite white. And this is what's interesting about whiteness as a phenomenon, right? How it gets sort of collapsed into phenotype. But I just thought it was pretty. I don't want to use too strong a word, but I was going for, let's just say sad. It was sad that she had to take this, that they had to put her on blast, and that they had to they suspended her, right? And it was just such an instantiation of how low our discourse is, when this one was so obvious what was happening. And what was interesting to me is that it sort of reflected the tensions of contemporary liberal discussions about race, where it's both at one hand totally constructed, but also really real, right? And so it was, I think, reflected in her belief, where she's like, well, Jews are white, so across all time and space, that they're white. And I think that it's sad that we couldn't actually have a more sophisticated discussion as like a demos about what was actually happening there.
That's interesting to me. I mean, I read her as just being ignorant, and the reaction to her was as if she were venal. She was put in the stocks for a moral offense, when in fact she just didn't know European history very well.
Right. And then she was applying what is the racial discourse in the United States to a different context. That's literally all it was. It was so obvious to see, and would have taken 5 minutes of someone just explaining that, and she would have been like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's not a particularly difficult concept to understand, but the fact that people just went for the jugular immediately is just such a sad reflection. And just, I think it's a reflection of like the anger of our country right now. Like, people are angry and they're pissed off, and they're just looking for heads. And I think that's mostly what cancel culture is. I think we had an earlier discussion where I think when we're talking about elite spaces like the Times, it's mostly a way to like basically fire older people who you want to advance past. I think it's 99% that. But on the public scale, I think it just reflects people being angry, and they want to like make other people suffer. And that's a sign of an unhealthy society that capitalism necessarily has wrought.
Let's explore that last for a minute.
I know.
Capitalism is responsible for cancel culture? Really?
Well, I think that the inequalities of our society engender a culture like that. I think when people feel that they don't have actual... So I recently wrote a piece, you might find this interesting, called The End of Mass Politics. And it was a little bit of a think piece. But what I think is happening right now is that we live in a world where there's the appearance of mass institutions. There's the appearance of large-scale political parties. We have a mass media. We have social media. So on one hand, we live in a moment where the ordinary person feels like they have the ability to really express a political opinion, right? You're able to go on Twitter and tweet something, or Facebook, blah, 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 blah. But I think when you look at how power actually functions, it's relatively cloistered, like foreign policy right now. What the public thinks about foreign policy, it's going to have almost no effect on what decisions that elites make. What the public thinks about macroeconomic policy is going to have no effect on what elites think. The public wants basically nationalized healthcare. That has had no effect. The public wants whatever, free pre-K or free childcare. That has no effect. So on one hand, you have the appearance of a mass politics without the actual ability to affect politics itself. And I think that's driving people insane. And I think that reflects a lot of our political discourse. So I think we actually live in a post-mass age, right? We had the institutions of the 1920s, but we don't have the ability to affect things like we did in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I think this really has engendered a disconnect within people's psyche about how they experience politics. And that's one of the many, many reasons that people are super mad. And I could explain that if that was unclear, but I think mass politics is no longer actually a thing, even if it appears like it is.
I'm not sure why that's bad. Uh, I'm not sure why the public should get everything it wants. I can see mass delirium. I can see moral panic. I think maybe a system that makes it hard for the demos to assert itself might be a wise system, even if not always a just system.
So
I
you're
think
a
it should be
progressive.
slow to change. We should be slow to change fundamental institutions, and
Well, so what's interesting, I think your position combines interesting. It's a very post World War II position, which is on one hand, you're a capital P progressive, which is you think the experts should rule. That was the progressive movement, right? We don't want Tammany Hall, we want the social scientists. But on the other hand, there's this sort of like post World War II conservatism, which is like the institutions are good. The institutions built by the progressives, I might add. The institutions are good, and we don't want to change them. So it's a very sort of combination of positions. What I would say is, again, I'm a historian. You look to history, the experts have fucked up time and time again. I don't think the demos could get it any worse. And I think it might actually lead to some sort of dialectic where there's a position that's better between expertise and the public. I don't want to get rid of the experts. I think that's foolish. I think the Lippmann critique in some sense is correct. You can't be an omnicompetent citizen, right? Society is way too complex for every individual to have an opinion about everything. You need,
this is
you
Walter
need experts.
Lippmann, Public Opinion.
Yes, public opinion, exactly, and the phantom public. 1922 and 1925, debate between John Dewey in the 20s. Dewey wrote 2 reviews in the New Republic, and he also wrote The Public and Its Problems. So it's interesting. I write about it in my book. But so I think there's an insight there, right? But the problem is you could argue that in the 20s, but the last 100 years have shown that experts have, repeatedly messed things up in a lot of ways. I know foreign policy the best, but I don't think like a hyper unequal society like we have today suggests that the economic experts are also getting things right all the time. So I think that does suggest that public opinion, particularly an enlightened public opinion, an educated public opinion, could serve a useful function in a democratic polity. I think that is something that we've really abandoned. And it's one of the reasons why people feel so angry today and so disconnected from politics. And one of the reasons why you vote for someone like Donald Trump, which is just to grenade the system effectively.
So you think in the 20s and 30s, the leverage that mass opinion had over national policy was greater, and what's the evidence for that?
Well, I think a couple things. The American state doesn't become the American state we know and love today until World War II. So there's a much, much weaker state in the 1920s and the 1930s. So as this state is being formed, I think you see policymakers at the time actually taking public opinion far more seriously. And I think you just see that in the New Deal. We haven't really had a New Deal like social program in almost 100 years. And I think one of the reasons that Roosevelt did that was to save capitalism from the critique that was coming from the left, but also from the public at large. The labor strikes, the unemployment lines, the search for jobs in a newly industrialized, or really, I guess it's industrialized, but an industrialized society. And so you have a responsive government. But what happens after World War II is you have the formation of an American state that is so complex and so unique, and I think most importantly, public and private. The American state very much outsources a lot of its functions to private corporations. Like, for example, one could imagine a world in which it's the government's function to make weapons so that you remove capitalist incentives from war, but we don't have that system. We have private military contractors, et cetera, which are essentially, that's a government function. I think, building of weapons for national defense is potentially a government function. They also get so much of their money from the government. You have the creation of think tanks, which is essentially they're creating policy outside the government, funded by the government. So you have the establishment of a state that is uniquely public and private and very difficult for the ordinary person to affect or even get a hold on. So when I was advising the Bernie campaign, right, we were asked like what would happen on day one. I'm like, we need task forces to see how this Leviathan actually functions. And I think that the complexity of the American state makes it very difficult for ordinary people to have a sense of what's going on or to affect what's going on.
Okay, now you're venturing into territory that I have some familiarity with. Privatization. the decision about whether or not you should employ people to pick up the garbage, or you should contract with a garbage, if you're the city of Philadelphia, or you should contract with a garbage collection concern. The decision about whether, if you want children to be educated, you should do it with public employees through a large scale thing, or you should allow 1,000 flowers to bloom and let people make their own decisions. And there are some guidelines in economic logic about, how you want that boundary to be drawn based on, the incentives, the information, the structures of competition, and so on and so forth. I mean, if I have large public employee unions that capture the delivery of services, I may not have the same degree of ability to influence the delivery of those services on behalf of consumers, et cetera, et cetera. There might be some kinds of economies of scale or scope where I don't think the government is capable of doing. I wouldn't want research laboratories all to be run by the federal government, for example. I'm thinking that there might be some value in, anyway.
But why research laboratories? The greatest advancements in technology occurred during World War II, when basically the government centralized everyone at the MIT Radiation Laboratory or at the Manhattan Project.
Well, I'm not against public research laboratories. I'm against the public monopolization of research within those laboratories. I want to see university research-based research enterprises. I want to see private sector-based research enterprises working on stuff.
Yeah,
but
that's
it's more an intuition than it. Pardon?
Yeah. That's the Vannevar Bush position. That's why big science took it because Vannevar Bush, it was this very important MIT guy, headed the Office of Scientific and Research and Development during World War II, the OSRD. That was his position, and he was very influential. And he's like, we need big science, which is funded by the government, but has these sorts of locations around the country. And I think there's still been plenty of capture, but that is a story for another day. But no, I think that that's a useful thing. And then you just look to history and look what actually happens. And then I think that has to take your guide. And I don't think that's resulted in great advances of human, to use the term popular today, human capital. I think public schooling isn't that great in this country. I think that the capture of universities by neoliberal corporatism isn't the greatest thing in the world.
How can you say public schooling is great when I'm looking at the disastrous effects of?
I said it isn't great.
Oh, you said it's not great.
Yeah, because it's based on property taxes. Like we created a system.
Okay, you should spell that out a little bit more. I misunderstood you.
Sorry, no. I think it hasn't gotten great, but because we've had these like mixed structures where instead of doing like blanket funding, we base it on property taxes, so the rich people get the good education and the poor people get the bad education. And I think this is what happens ultimately in a capitalist system. I mean, I think the market is a tool that has been overused in this particular social structure for the last 60
But we're
or 70
talking about
years.
public education.
Yeah, but it marketized public education. I mean, the logic could still be a market even if it's technically public. I mean, how it funds.
What would you do? I'm literally curious. I'll declare that I am a pro educational choice guy. My gut instinct is to let parents make decisions on behalf of their children and to allow for there to be many different sources of educational service provision. What would you do?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but I think you definitely have to get rid of the funding it through property taxes. That seems to be a recipe for inequality in public education. I think you probably have to pay teachers more. I think you probably have to revisit the Deweyan model of people sitting in a classroom for 8 hours that was, made for the industrial era. I think you have to have all sorts of reforms that are basically impossible in the present system.
But with charter schools and with independent schools, whether they be parochial or not, with people free to take many different approaches to delivering education to kids, wouldn't there be a greater chance of getting some of the pedagogic reforms that you advocate? And if you were to control the delivery of money to support education from the government by channeling it in an equal basis through vouchers or grants to families, you could bypass the property tax system and guarantee an equality of the government support for education, irrespective of the income of the community that kids' families were living in.
So I would actually ask you, has that happened?
Well, no, it hasn't happened because
So then why?
everybody who wants to do something along the lines that I'm talking about gets opposed by public employee unions who want to maintain the status quo.
Again, I don't know much about it, but is it just the public employee unions, or is it because rich people are fixing the system to benefit
It's not
themselves
just
and
the
their own
public
kids?
employee
Yeah.
unions. If you propose merging, I used to live in Boston. Brookline is a separate town. It's got wonderful schools. Boston Public Schools and Newton is a separate town. It's got wonderful schools. Wellesley is a separate town. It's got wonderful schools. And if you propose merging them all together and busing kids back and forth, everybody would go ballistic.
Yeah, shock
They-
among shocks.
They'd say we've got a Metco program which allows a few hundred kids to get bussed out. But if you're trying to take control of my kids' future and put it on the same plane with these kids from the inner city future, I'll fight you to the death. I'm sure.
Yeah, and because everyone feels precarious, everyone's worried about proletarianization, and that's a function of capitalism. That's a function of the system we created, where you could fall in class and then lose all of your privileges, ultimately, and that has sort of perverse effects like the one we're talking about. Yeah, that's what I'd say about that one. Yeah,
But the world is insecure. You're blaming capitalism for the fact that people.
the world could be made less insecure. I mean, I don't think that's an impossibility. The world doesn't have to be as precarious as the one that we've created, particularly for such a wealthy society like this one. I think
Where on earth is this society that you envision actually being enacted?
Well, if I was cheeky, I would say, Cuba, free healthcare. But
Yeah, that would be cheeky.
yeah, free but just because, I mean, when people ask me that, I'm like, the nation state is barely 350 years old. Let's give it some time before we foreclose all forms of possibility here. That's what I say to that. Just because something hasn't necessarily happened in the world doesn't mean that it's impossible. The public didn't get the vote. We didn't have true democracy in this country until the 1960s. So let's give it some time before we foreclose possibilities and make ontological statements about what human beings are, thereby saying that it's essentially impossible to live in a non-precarious society.
Okay. Somebody's going to call you a utopian.
Well, I mean, what's wrong with utopianism? I mean, first of all, the free market's a utopia. Friedrich Hayek was a utopian. Ludwig von Mises is a utopian. The idea that the free market's going to work everything out. Utopian thinking is important. At least it's setting out a goal. It's you might not ever reach that goal, but depends on it serves as sort of a north star where you're moving toward. I'm fine with utopianism.
What my colleague at the Hoover Institution, Thomas Sowell, would say is that this is a vision. This is a vision of possibility that fails to come to terms with the tragic reality of limited resources and human nature. You would remake, in the spirit of visionary Soviet ideology, you would remake the man and woman, and you would repeal the laws of supply and demand, the laws of there's no free lunch, the laws of people respond to incentives, and so on and so on.
I would ask Professor Sowell how he's so sure of what human nature is. That's a pretty important, gigantic leap to make, that what human nature is. There's no such thing as Robinson Crusoe. Humans don't exist outside culture. How would you ever determine what capital I is, what human nature capital I is? It's impossible.
Propensity
it's
to truck,
impossible.
barter, and exchange. This is Adam Smith and whatnot, but
yeah, I mean, Adam Smith was talking about a theory of moral sentiments. Emphasis is theory
as well.
And I mean, I just think it's fundamentally, as a historian, like, there's no humans have propensities. Maybe. How the hell would we ever determine what they were? You don't exist outside of culture. And if you did exist outside of culture, that's not natural anyway. So why is that a more real, quote unquote, example of human propensity or human nature? I think Sowell's 91. I think he's like very much like a guy who was educated in the 50s and the 60s, where people were like making huge claims about human nature vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, which I just think are empirically impossible to prove. You can't know what human nature is. It's impossible.
Yeah. I remember some of my best arguments in my book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, Harvard University Press, 2002, reissued in a new edition with a new preface, 2022. I remember some of the best arguments in that book were very much in the spirit of what you just said, which is we don't exist outside of the flow of history and the web of culture. I was talking about color blindness and racial inequality. And I was saying that the liberal idea, every tub on its own bottom, individuals separate from one another, freedom of, action, and freedom from government coercion rooted in racial identity, was an idea, when applied to the problem of persisting racial inequality, that was divorced from the flow of history. After all, slavery and racial domination at the core of the evolution of the United States, and the web of culture, which is that race is not simply a thing. It's not just simply a natural thing. It's also a social creation. It's a product of our own making and remaking. So I'm not unfamiliar with these arguments, but that makes me want to ask you, as we kind of wind down here, what your thinking is. We're jumping around a little bit about the affirmative action debate in higher education, and more generally about meritocracy. About this is an empire in decline, and China is a nation on the rise. I think we agreed to that. And the part of the debate about affirmative action, I hear this from my friends on the right, is that it's a compromise with our meritocratic standards, and it's a slide down a slippery slope into a kind of mediocrity. We're unwilling to enforce judgments of quality because of the disparate incidents that such enforcement would have. It will reveal the racial differences in performance that we don't want to confront, and so we are going to scrap the SAT, and we're going to get rid of the hoops that people have to jump through, or hurdles that they have to clear, on behalf of an egalitarian, racially egalitarian objective. And can you speak to this set of debates?
It is shocking to me that any professor in the year 2022 would claim that our system is a meritocratic system. Talk about utopianism. There seems to be no, as someone who's been in the university for basically the last 20 years, the big difference, and has taught all over the place. I taught at Columbia, I taught at Cornell, I gave lectures, class lectures at Dartmouth when I was a fellow there, at Duke, at UW. Do you know what the main difference between those students were, between the elite and non-elite? Money. And I think it's very clear that rich people have captured the social reproduction, the Ivy League and the elite colleges, which essentially serve, as Markovitz said in the book, the meritocracy trap.
Kids at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale are not any smarter than kids at UVA or University of West Virginia.
University. Yes, I would say they are not any smarter, but they certainly are richer. And so I would say that someone once had a phrase like, aristocracy was the ideology of feudalism. Meritocracy is the ideology of neoliberalism. I think it serves as a way to justify inequality, like Markovitz, I think, argued correctly in the book, in the meritocracy trap. I think it just doesn't really exist. I think people are basically born on third base, or they're not. And if you're born on third base, if you have rich parents, if you're able to access the tutors, if you're able to go to the feeder schools, if you're able to get into Harvard. And I think, Glenn, you might be more familiar immediately with this statistic, what is it? More people come from the top 10% of the income distribution go to Harvard than the bottom 90% or something? Do you think that's all a reflection of their increase? Something like that. Something ridiculous, right? So it's so obviously not a functioning system that it's to me, it's a joke that someone would claim that, affirmative action is getting in the way of our perfect meritocracy. What are you talking about? And it would be more serious to address
what I'm talking about is somebody got on the combined math and verbal 1,500 out of a 1,600 on the test, and somebody else got 1,100 out of 1,500 on the test. And I think there's a difference between the mental acuity and acquired mastery over intellectual work of those two people. Now, it turns out that if I want to have enough of group X, I'm talking about Blacks and Latino, I'm going to have to dip down the scale on the SAT in order to incorporate them into my student body. And I'm going to do that knowing full well that there are differences between individuals. I'm not talking about racial groups as such, and just how prepared they are to take on the very specialized kind of work that you do when you're operating at a high level in an academic environment. And that's what I'm talking about. So that's not a figment of my imagination. Now, it may be that disparity that I called attention to is itself a reflection of underlying economic and social inequalities and educational opportunity and the structure of families and what the society is doing in a larger sense. But the sheer judgment that if I use different standards to admit kids based on race, I can expect them to perform differently after I admit them is not a utopian judgment in my view. I think it's a fair
empirically
reading
demonstrated.
of the evidence.
Yeah, well, there's actually a left case for keeping the SAT because, scoring well on that is one of the only ways that one would be able to
overcome
oneself.
That class advantage.
To overcome that class advantage, right? And there's, I think, Freddie DeBoer, I don't know if you know Freddie DeBoer, but he's one.
I know the name.
Yeah, he's one who's been advocating that position. So to me, honestly, like I'm a bit agnostic on that because to me, it's like a superstructural problem almost, right? The problem is that we have 8 institutions that produce the entire elite, and everyone who's rich is able to go to these institutions, and most people who are not rich are not able to go to these institutions. So when you're arguing at that level, I think to me, you're ignoring which is the real problem, which again is this sort of cloistering of an basically oligarchic aristocratic elite in a series of institutions. And that's the problem that we really need to be addressing, which is again caused by capitalism, because you have to go to these to maintain your class position in the society. You have to go to a Harvard, you have to go to a Columbia, or really you have to go to a top 40 research a university, to expand beyond the Ivy League. And that's the problem. The problem is that you need to go to these schools to maintain your class position. When we're talking about affirmative action and getting rid of the SAT or not getting rid of the SAT, it's to me sort of an elision of what I find to be the major issue here, which is the cloistered elite gathering at institutions.
Aren't all of we academic specialists elitist of a sort? I mean, wouldn't we be pissed off if publishing houses just decided to publish manuscripts at random rather than vetting them, or if academic journals just decided to publish articles based on criteria other than the rarefied assessments of expert practitioners of the craft, whether it be history, economics, theoretical physics, or whatever? Sure. Don't we think that some schools are, quote, better than others based upon, well, I read the books, I saw the research program, I know the graduate students, and the one coming from this department are better than the ones coming from that department?
Well, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I think, like, given the state of the academic job market, at this point, it's random. Like the random person who gets the Harvard job is not appreciably different from the random person who gets the West Virginia University job. The academic job market is so bad that I don't think you can make those fine distinctions. It's essentially
you don't think Harvard and West Virginia's history departments can be compared effectively as one is stronger or better, quote unquote, than the other?
So let's say we're talking about history, like even when I compare myself to someone at Columbia, they get so much more money than I do. At UW to pay research assistants, to go to archival trips, to get time off, to get sabbatical years. It's impossible to divorce from that. Like my friends at Dartmouth, they teach. I don't not Dartmouth. I don't know specifics there, but like they teach for 3 years, they get a year off. I don't get that. I get after 7 years, I get like a part-time off. So like maybe they're able to produce more, but because they have the resources to produce more. So no, I actually don't think you're able to make those distinctions so easily. I don't think you can, frankly. No, I disagree with that.
Yeah, we couldn't disagree more strongly about that, although I don't know your field. In my field, I think I really do know the difference between people who are, in that select group of truly extraordinary contributors.
But Glenn, I have a question. For that. So let's say like you're able to tell the difference, but there are so many value judgments in that. If someone was doing economic history of a qualitative sort, they could basically never get hired at a Harvard, right? Essentially, right? You have to have a form of mathematical sophistication, which I would say fetishization of quantitative knowledge. And so all those things, I don't think you can make that objective distinction. Maybe you can make it in 150 years. When time has passed, but I promise you a lot of really famous professors who are really super famous in the 20s and the 30s, no one's ever heard of because their work hasn't stood the test of time. And so I
No,
think also I'm informed as someone who studies the history of universities, and like people who are the biggest names of all time, no one remembers them. Who knows who E.R.A. Seligman is? This guy was the biggest guy on earth for 20 years in the 20s and the 30s. So I don't think you're able to make that judgment personally. That might be because of my
uh,
historical bias.
no. I'm going to grant the point that there are, uh, I don't know what aesthetic judgments or fads that affect disciplines, and they come and they go, and people who are thought to be great, and at one point in time may, in retrospect, not look so good. And I grant the point that within economics, we have a particular way of construing what we take to be serious research that relies heavily upon quantification and mathematically assisted analysis and so on. And one could question, and many have done, whether or not that's the only way of trying to do economics. And it really gets down to what's economics, what's sociology, what's history, and the disciplines draw their
Well,
boundaries.
I think it gets down to who funds what at the university in the 1950s. That's what it gets down to. Why did economics take a quantified term? Why did political science take a quantified term? Because
Uh,
during the early Cold War, people wanted like certain knowledge. And so they funded these departments, they funded particular approaches, and they didn't fund others. Basically, because some rich philanthropists in the 40s
uh,
and the 50s decided, now we have to say it as the gospel truth. And I think this is what history is useful. You could actually
well, no,
denaturalize things.
I think you're giving short shrift to the power and the beauty of certain ideas. Maybe ideas that can't be appreciated unless you're an insider. So, I mean, I give one example: Kenneth Arrow. He's late. He's dead now. He died a couple of years ago. He's a great man, one of the great economists of the 20th century. So he did a lot of stuff. One of them was this book, Social Choice and Individual Values, which was a piece
1951.
of philosophy and mathematically assisted political theory that was just a beautiful idea. And I think for Neumann and Morgenstern's
Morgenstern.
game theory. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm going to talk
Funded
about
by the
game
Rand
theory.
Corporation.
No, I know, but the ideas. I mean, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to separate your what I would call reductive arguments based on they had some interest, therefore, from the fact that the ideas have an independent existence. I mean, it would be almost like trying to explain modern jazz by reference to who owned the nightclubs.
I think music is a different form of expression. And one, you could make arguments about that, but I would just point people to Paul Erickson's book, The World the Game Theorists Made, which really goes deep into why game theory, as opposed to other approaches, was funded and supported by particular institutions in the 40s and the 50s. And I think there's some truth to sort of the separate ideas existing out in a space. But I would suggest that it is the reason that these things dominated was not necessarily the beauty of the ideas, but because they had particular types of support in a particular political, economic, and institutional structure. Even though the ideas do matter, but
Well, game theory, for example, it's everywhere in economics because it deals with the interaction of small numbers of people who have their respective interests and information, and it tries to resolve how it is that when they do interact with each other, you can predict what the outcomes will be, extending the framework from the atomistic market of competitive price takers to a world in which you can envision giving an account of how negotiations will take place and bargaining between people, and how conflict resolution and so on might, and including, including mutually assured destruction,
shelling, yeah,
which is it's a political phenomenon, but the analysis of it is a universal intellectual problem. It's quite independent of what the interest of the people who posed the problem might have been.
So I think I would probably disagree with that. So I think I'm very much influenced by the historical literature, I also should mention the work of S.M. Amadei, who wrote a book called Rationalizing Capitalist Democracy, which really goes into why game theory was funded and supported in the 40s and the 50s. Even when you take like a game theoretic exchange, right? That often assumes like what I hate to do this because I feel it's a little cheap, but it's true. Like a white man in the 1950s assumed should be people assume the way people interacted in the world, right? You can imagine, a woman with a different set of social assumptions about what would lead to a greater good might not necessarily develop a system based on mutual antagonistic exchange, or where you could come together in the prisoner's dilemma. I wish I could remember the essay.
But what I can't imagine is Google, Microsoft, and Facebook interacting with each other in the new tech space without reference to the fact that each one is trying to get as big a market share and secure as much profit as they want. And that's the arena, that kind of arena, an antitrust law or understanding competition between large corporations and things of this kind that I see game theory is applying to. And I can't imagine that whether it was a man or a woman or a white or a gay could matter a whit if I were trying to predict what Google, Microsoft, Facebook, et cetera, are going to do.
So I think that's a perfect example. So I think for that, you'd have to know who Mark Zuckerberg is, right? And Mark Zuckerberg, who just lost, $500 billion making a wacky bet on Meta. Is that something that game theory could express without knowing who the hell Mark Zuckerberg is? I don't think he would have made that choice, if you're examining it as some sort of disembodied monad. So again, that's a perfect example for just showing how you actually need history. You actually need the qualitative knowledge if you're applying it to the world. Now, that's not as elegant.
I'm not trying to get rid of history. You're the one who's trying to get rid of game theory.
No, I think it's a useful tool. I think the problem is that it's become the tool or the way. Right. I think it's an incredibly useful tool. Yeah. No, I'm not getting rid of it. All of these things are incredibly useful tools. System analysis, game theory, Monte Carlo methods. Except you want to use it. The problem is the fetishization of it as the way of knowing. The problem is that Berkeley is the only program to teach an economic history course. That's the problem. Not the tools in and of themselves. It's the social function or the social position that the tool has accrued. I
agree with you. They don't teach the history of economic thought either. They don't read Smith and Ricardo and Mill and Marx and Keynes.
I was just reading Walras and Marshall this past week, and they're like,
Volra is what we say. Volra.
Volra. People always mispronounce Weber as Weber, and I always correct them. Or von Mises as von Mises. Volra. But these guys are like, whoa, be careful what you apply economics to. That's like one of their biggest messages. They're like, this is very useful for certain types of exchange, but don't make it like the way you view the world, the prism through which you view the world.
When I was in graduate school nearly a half century ago, they still taught us about Volra and Leon and Pareto and these people. And they still had a sense of the interaction between philosophy, history, economics, politics, even though the quantification was well advanced. But there was a kind of memory. I was taught by people like Paul Samuelson, who himself an embodiment of mathematical applied mathematical specialization, but he had a long, wide view of the discipline. And we taught economic history too. We were taught the application of economic methods to trying to, I don't know what you think about it, Time on the Cross, the book about slavery, Fogel and Ingerman, Robert Fogel, who ended up with a Nobel recognition for his contributions to quantitative economic history. Cleometrics, they called it at the time. Cleometrics, the god of history put to the mathematical test. But that has changed.
That was at Rochester, right? Engerman was at Rochester. I believe so. And Rochester is a very quant department.
Yeah, he was at Rochester before moving to Chicago, Fogel.
Yeah.
Ingerman was also at Rochester.
His son's a big historian at Yale, David Engerman now. Very big historian of diplomatic history. But no, I mean, I think those are all useful tools. Absolutely. And they should never be discarded. The problem is that in our particular historical moment, they're emphasized at the expense of other equally valuable, I would even say when you're talking about politics, probably more valuable approaches to understanding the world.
Okay, let's conclude, Daniel. This is Daniel Bessner I'm with here. He's a man of the left, and he's also a historian, and he's very jealously protective of the prerogatives of his discipline, and he's very skeptical about some of the foundations of my own, and that's what makes the world go round. So we'll talk again, Daniel. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Glenn. Really appreciate it.